I hurried home before my final errand. In my left hand, I held a most gorgeous corsage that I had carefully picked out for Eva's mother. I cradled it carefully so as not to crush it. I carried my suit over my right shoulder, holding it up with my index finger by the hook of its coat hanger. My next tasks were to drop these off at home, turn around to pick up my freshly brushed hat from Kleinfeld's, return back home, polish my shoes, then head right out to meet Eva and her parents at Schmidt's restaurant to formally announce our engagement. A man popped out from the nook between the shops and held his palm out. He had appeared so suddenly that his hand slammed into my chest and sent me hurtling backwards. I landed on my back, crumpling my suit. The corsage flew out of my hand and into the air. I watched it crest above me when the small man attempted to catch it. However, he overcompensated and smashed the corsage between his hands. I was mortified. "Excuse you!" I shouted, lifting myself up from a puddle. He stared at me with beady eyes that were too far apart, set above a nose that was concerningly small. A tiny mustache sat above lips so thin they were hardly visible. "You're needed," he said to me without helping me up or apologizing. He looked at the crumpled corsage at his tiny feet. "It appears your corsage has been crushed," he muttered. He motioned with his hand for me to rise. "The room he's in is rather humid. It should unwrinkle your suit in no time, so follow me." He clicked his tiny heels down the alley. I had no time to drop the suit off to be pressed again. With little recourse, I followed him, jogging to catch up. "This room better be as humid as promised," I muttered to myself helplessly. The man led me down a serpentine path between and behind buildings. With every turn, he was a little farther out of sight. I called for him to stop, but he either didn't hear me or I was purposely ignored. I felt so insulted my face burned. I found myself lost in a strange alley that further narrowed in the distance. My heart pounded. If I were late to dinner, Eva would cancel the engagement for certain. "There's no time!" the small man nearly shouted, popping out of a door to my right that I had just now noticed. He pulled me into a room by my arm and took my suit. I was hit with a wave of humidity and stale air. While it smelled unpleasant, at least hope remained for my poor suit. But what would I do about the corsage? My eyes adjusted to the darkness. I finally saw a man lying in bed wearing only a cloth over his shame. He had cuts running across his left thigh, a severe wound on his hands that exposed his tendons, and a small gash across his belly, revealing the outer membrane of his intestines. A single small wound in his chest, no bigger than 2 inches, leaked blood continually, and it smelled of rosewater. "This man needs to see a doctor!" I cried, feeling woozy at the sight of blood. "That's what we've said all along!" shouted a man in a collared shirt with no jacket. 5 men on his side cheered and patted him on the back. "We'll have no such thing!" shouted a bearded man in a gray suit. The 5 men on his side congratulated him with "Hear, hear!" Around the bed stood 12 men total, 6 on each side. "There is no conversation," I said sternly. "This man is on the brink of death." "That's exactly the problem," the small man said, pulling me by the arm, stage whispering. "This is a sensitive issue." He frowned theatrically and motioned to the injured man. "We must handle this with utmost care, for you see, this man is the Son of God." I gave the dying man another look, and sure enough, it was the Son of God. The halo around his head was slightly dimmed, and his face was pale. How do you do?" I said to him dismissively. More pressing matters were at hand. If I didn't pick up my hat from Kleinfeld's, I feared Eva's father would never respect me. The Son of God nodded solemnly. His puppy dog eyes did nothing to change my mood. The tiny man led me to a door on the other side of the room. "Hurry," he explained to me quickly. "Go find Father Dietrich at St. Gustavus. I'll keep the argument at bay here." He turned, shaking his head in frustration. "Why don't you dispatch 1 man from each group?" I suggested tersely. "1 to find a doctor, 1 to find a priest." "I'll I'll do no such thing, one of the men cried. Could you even imagine? A man nearly screamed. The small man shook them off, annoyed. Go, he commanded, and pushed me out the door. I staggered back onto the street where we started. My ears pounded with rage. Why had the small man led me down that obnoxious route when all along the front door was right here where we started? I noticed a small group of people gathered at the front door. I swear I thought he was a burglar, an anguished man shouted, his suit covered in blood. He held a knife and waved it over his head. Gangway! Gangway! Shouted an older man in a high voice, elbowing his way through the crowd. He was overweight and shaped like a bean. His knotted features were bulbous and pink. Giant, wiry, white hair stuck out from his bushy eyebrows. Ridiculous, he muttered to me in an odd soprano as he pulled me away from the crowd. And today of all days, no doubt I should have seen this coming, no doubt. Well, the day was sure to come eventually, and here I am, unprepared, he spoke to himself. He led me away from the crowd towards the river. They'll all come after me with pitchforks, and while the irony isn't lost on me, it will be unpleasant all the same. And after all these years of struggle, I'm not the one responsible. Well, I suppose it was written this way, so it shall be. His story must be told, as it were. I couldn't help but feel moved by the worry in his eyes. They were glossy, as if he were on the verge of tears. I'm sorry, but you haven't mentioned your name, I cut in. To be frank, I was always quite fond of him. The story was blown up over time, as you can imagine. That said, we weren't friends by any stretch. In fact, he's the one who rebuked me. Not that any of this matters anymore, he said, words spiraling. He finally snapped out of his trance and looked at me. Where are my manners? He apologized. I do business as Heinrich K., although I'm historically known as the Devil. Charmed, I said vacantly. My thoughts were with the crushed corsage, my poor suit, and my hat. I didn't dare think about what jeopardy dinner was in. All water under the bridge, I suppose, he continued. You'll appreciate the irony of that sentiment in just a moment, he said, wiping a tear from his cheek. We leaned against the brick railing that looked over the river. He pulled a wadded piece of paper from his pocket and crumpled it in my hand. I trust you can deliver this to my son, he said to me sadly. I uncrumpled it as he bent down to his feet. I tried to read it, but I couldn't make out the handwriting. Excuse me, that's for his eyes only, he said sternly in his high voice. He was tying a rope around his ankle and attached a heavy rock to it that I hadn't noticed until now. Okay, I appreciate your anxiety, but I have no time to help today. Another day, fine, but not today, I said, trying to control my voice. He looked at me dumbfounded. After a moment, he said, I really must insist. He stared at me seriously, then forced a smile. Well, Godspeed, to use a phrase, he joked, then jumped over the railing. He disappeared into the river, the rock disappearing him into the depths. I was now more than slightly annoyed. Although selfish, I decided the Son of God's problems were not my problems, nor were the devil's. The pressing issue was the status of my engagement with Eva, and I wouldn't threaten that at any cost. I wadded up the note and leaned back to throw it in the river when a hand caught my arm and stopped me. I turned around, nearly tripping, but was held up by the intruder. It was a haggard-looking woman with a boy at her side in a white robe and a Roman collar. He could have been no more than 15 years old. It's shameful to break a promise, you know, she said in a soft voice. Scraggly white hair wound around her nearly bald head. She had a tiny nose and a concerningly small mouth. Excuse me, ma'am, I bit back, but it's also quite rude to impress yourself on an innocent, busy man. She stared at me guiltily as the boy played with his robes. How did he look? She asked after a long pause. He just jumped in the river. How do you think he looks? I shouted back. No, never mind him, although I guess that is a tragedy. No, I'm asking about my son, she said quietly. He's right there, ask him, I said rudely, pointing to the boy. She laughed. No, that is not my son. This is Father Dietrich. Say hello, Father Dietrich. The boy bashfully waved. A man? No, wait. A boy of the cloth? This is ridiculous, I guffawed. She spoke over my insult. My son is the Son of God, and I understand he's been injured, she said calmly. Upon further inspection, she was, in fact, the Mother of God. I hadn't noticed her halo until that moment. This irritated me further. Sorry, ma'am, but I'm out of favors for the day, I snapped. She crossed her arms and hung her head. Well, at the very least, could you give the boy the note? She asked meekly. He just witnessed his own father's suicide. It's the least you could do. I rolled my eyes heavily, too frustrated to even inquire about the mechanics of such a relationship or the boy's apparent ordination to begin with. I handed him the note, and the boy grabbed my arm. I understand I'm needed, he said in a deep voice, staring at me with piercing eyes. The Son of God's assistant. He asked for me, didn't he? I didn't respond. Play games all you'd like, but it's your duty to direct me there. Without hesitating, he dragged me down the road towards the ailing Son of God. In my heart, I said goodbye to my hat. I said goodbye to my pressed suit and to my engagement with Eva. The sun was setting, and I would surely be late. I repeated all these insane events in my head over and over until we arrived at the house. The boy priest led me inside, followed by the Mother of God. The room was deathly silent. As my eyes adjusted to the light, I saw the small man pulling a blanket over the Son of God's face. He had died. The Mother of God sighed, and Father Dietrich lowered his boyish head. The pro-doctor group and the anti-doctor group joined as one and hugged each other. The silence was broken by gentle weeping. Rage built inside me, and finally I burst. This is it then, I shouted. All this nonsense, all this running around, and for what? A dead Son of God? Do you have any idea what you've done to my life? Oh, my poor Eva. I paused. You! The small man! Bring me my suit! I screamed insanely. The small man stared at me, shocked. He stammered. Well, I'm not sure where I placed it. Perfect! Perfect then, just perfect! Too angry for words, I stormed towards the door when the small man stopped me. But don't you understand? He asked, eyes glossy. You have been appointed. You are now the Son of God, he said to me, voice quivering. My foot! I'm the Son of God. Let me go! I brushed off his arm when the door swung open. A man 7 feet tall with cropped hair and a theatrical mustache stood in the doorway. Bruno! He screamed. Blood drained from my face. It was Eva's father. Herr Kurtz! I shouted back. Sir, there's been a spectacular misunderstanding. Ah! I've heard all about it! He screamed. And I'll have you know, with the way you're dressed now, in that leisurely suit and no hat! He paused, blood boiling. I can assure you, you will never have my daughter's hand in marriage! He slammed the door behind him before I could answer. I sprinted towards the door and swung it open. A burglar! The anguished man with the knife screamed before I could chase after Herr Kurtz. The knife-wielding man lunged towards me, eyes bloodshot and mouth foaming. It's happening again! He cried. No! I managed to scream before he plunged the knife into my chest. I raised my hand to stop him, and he slashed it, revealing my tendons. He stabbed me across the thigh before cutting open my belly and exposing the membrane of my intestines. Someone call a doctor! A man shouted from the room. I'll stand for no such thing! shouted another man back at him. A quarrel immediately erupted in the room. My vision tunneled as I thought of my lost, sweet Eva. As my life slipped away, I heard the tiny man say, "Well, I suppose Father Dietrich might as well be the Son of God now." A gentle murmuring bled from the room. And that's how the son of the devil became the son of God. The end.